Hello and welcome to my presentation. Here I'll be talking about how a muscle contracts and the different types of contraction. The contraction first begins through a stimulus. This could be a ball which is coming towards you. The stimulus is then sends an impulse to the sense organs. This is the eyes. This is done through the sensory neurons, which then sends an impulse to the brain. The sense organs and sensory neuron are part of the peripheral nervous system. The brain then sends an impulse to the spinal cord. These two parts are part of the central nervous system. This impulse is then sent to a motor neuron. From here, the impulse arrives at the motor neuron. It travels along the axon and gets charged by the myelin fatty sheaths on the axon. This charges the impulse and it jumps along the gaps between the axon. This is saltatory conduction. From here, the impulse then arrives at the neuromuscular junction and gets to the end of the dendrites. The impulse then needs to travel across the synaptic cleft. This is a gap between the muscle fiber and the neuromuscular junction. The impulse travels across with action potential and acetylcholine from the fascicles. This then joins the receptors on the muscle fibers. We are able to see how this is done with the two images on the right. The bottom one shows where the receptors are in the synaptic cleft, while the top one shows the motor neuron in a full image. As the impulse has arrived at the receptors of a muscle fiber, it must go through the T-tubules. These are found in the muscle fiber, and this goes to the sacroplasmic rectilium. From here, the impulse triggers the release of calcium. The calcium then removes the trypsin and trypomyosin layers which cover the active binding site. The active binding site is then free for the myosin as sarcomere. This then joins together with the active binding site and the myosin. This creates cross bridges between the two. The myosin changes energy from ATP to ADP plus P. The myosin then grabs onto the active binding site. This creates a rowing action as they are constantly moving backwards and forwards. But the myosin needs more ATP to release and bind to another active binding site. From this image on the left, we are able to see the myosin. The myosin then grabs onto this yellow figure. This figure is called the actin. The myosin grabs onto the actin on binding sites. This changes the shape of the myosin as it's a protein. To rechange and to release the myosin, it needs more ATP. This creates a new binding site for the myosin to join onto. When the myosin lets go of actin binding site, it changes. It converts its ATP energy to ADP plus P energy. Many myosins are doing this at one time. As this happens, the sarcomere gets shorter. This then contracts the muscle, and this is why the muscle gets shorter. There are also different types of discs. These overlap and shorten, creating a shortening in the myofibril. Sarcomeres shortening, creating a contraction in the muscle. These Z discs just divide the sarcomere, while the I bands are just made of myosin. They overlap in contraction and they create smaller bands. The A band and the H zone of the sarcomere both contain actin and myosin. They are the region of the striated muscle fiber that contains only thick myosin filaments. These bands and zones help with the contraction of the muscle and provide actin and protein. And then this is how a muscle contracts with the sliding filament theory. But there are different types of contractions. One of these is isometric. This type of contraction is where the muscles contract but they do not change their length or do not move. An example of where a isometric contraction would take place is in a plank. The abdominal muscles would be contracting but they do not move. If this was put into a sporting example, this would be where you are being lifted up in a line out in rugby. Whilst you are being lifted up, you need your abdominals for you to control where you are leaning back and forth. These do not move though, they are staying still but contracting to keep you in balance. A different way of contraction would be concentric. This type of contraction is where the muscle gets shorter in length and moves. As you can see by the image on the right, it shows a bicep curl happening. The bicep brachii is lifting the weight up, causing the muscle to get shorter and causing a movement. A sporting example in rugby would be when you were going into a tackle. You would have to bend down, creating the muscles to get shorter, and they contract concentrically. A different way of contraction would be eccentrically. This type of contraction is where the muscle lengthens and gets longer. By this image on the left we are able to see this. The bicep brachii is contracting, but it is moving away. This is how the muscle gets longer, because it is moving away whilst contracting. An example of this in rugby would be when the muscles need to contract eccentrically while passing, as you are putting the ball further away while you are passing, but the muscles are still contracting. The last way of contraction would be isokinetically. This contraction is where the movements produced are working at a constant speed. An example of when you are using isokinetic contraction would be through a leg lift or a leg press. As we contract these ways, we would get tired, and so would the muscle fibers which are contracting. There is something called spatial summation, which is spacing out responsibility of contracting. This means a pair of muscle fibers would contract first. These would then have a rest while other pairs of muscle fibers contract. This creates a constant passing around of contraction, which means the muscle fibers do not get tired as quickly. If the contraction is more intense, the more muscle fibers will be recruited. They're more recruited because of the intensity, and it creates a bigger contraction. These are the different ways of contraction. These take place in everyday life and many sporting examples. These occur in all types of sports, ranging from team sports to gymnastics to swimming. Anyway, thank you for listening to my presentation.